Hello and welcome to this week's What Were They Thinking? Among the variety of news items we have for you are concerns about aspartame and the fact that they really shouldn't be. The difference in wound healing rates between humans and other animals could explain some of our strange phenomena. Ischaemic colitis and a weird case report associated with it. Giant prehistoric kangaroos in Australia were going to die no matter what happened, and not just because it's Australia. A bacteria that can conduct electricity just like a wire, but entirely biological. A scientific trick, let's call it, that can delay your pot from boiling over, although the keyword there is delay. Maths finds a solution to one of the oldest algebra problems. State lawmakers are looking to ban chemtrails via law, and a Bush official only adds fuel to conspiracy claims around essentially a evil lair for the ultra-rich and powerful. The timestamps for these and other news items can be found in the description box below. We'll start with artificial sweeteners and perhaps the most common, aspartame. Aspartame is basically a sugar that the human body can't digest, which is all well and good. It means that your beverage, in this case, or most often, is sweet, such as with Diet Coke or Pepsi, but it doesn't add calories. The key word there being no calories. It does, however, have other effects. Now, the other effects will vary considerably, but for the most part, it's basically that you end up having a laxative, which means you will need to go to the toilet more frequently, but at least you won't look like a potato. Well, more of a potato. Why this is important, especially in the current world, is, well, a disturbing number of people are obese. In some countries, it's as high as a third, and in some countries, more than half the population is overweight. Not necessarily obese, but overweight. This is where a recent publication from the British Medical Journal says that you shouldn't be consuming artificial sweeteners. Which, okay, that sounds all well and good in theory. Don't take sweeteners, don't take excess sugar, just be sad. Oh wait, that doesn't work. And this is why the particular article, although yes, useful and nice to know about, doesn't actually add much, let's say, context or useful information to the literature. And the reason why is simple. The amount you'd actually need to consume of aspartame well and truly exceed typical doses for the humans who would be consuming it compared to, say, rodent models. Compare that to the potential benefits, and you have a very lopsided equation, very much in favor of using aspartame. Understand, it's not intended to specifically be a all-in-one solution. It doesn't solve everything, but it does address some of the major problems. And of course, we have to go back to IARC, a part of the United Nations which has basically become the red-headed stepchild of the UN, in that they are unloved, often unwanted, and very much in the wrong. In this case, it's wrong because they keep linking things like aspartame and other things to cancer, without giving the actual risk of developing cancer from it. We could tell you right now that water is linked to cancer, but that's only because everybody consumes water and there's a good chance you'll develop cancer. Therefore, water is linked. There's no actual risk of water causing cancer, but we can make that argument, which is what IARC seems to spend all its time doing. And the last possible argument is having to do with the GI tract and the microbes within it, and this one is very, very premature research. So in short, whatever you do find there, yeah, it might be useful, it might be interesting, but we actually have no clue as to whether or not you can extrapolate that out to the rest of the world. In something that is slightly more substantial, we have the idea of fungi on your skin acting as an antibiotic, which is actually not that crazy. It's something that's already well understood in terms of immunology. You have your own native flora, that is the bacteria, fungi, etc. that live on your skin, and these all provide a certain amount of protection from other external pathogens getting in. It's basically the scene from The Simpsons, where by virtue of the fact that Mr. Burns has every disease under the sun and some new ones, no one disease can actually get a foothold and therefore take advantage and cause, well, illness. It's the same sort of idea with your skin, except, well, for the most part, we're talking about not quite at that level. Same idea, just not as bad, or as evil. Still, the other key thing here is that, much like with bacteria, a fungi can work the same way. It's just that they are kept in check by the fact that your skin produces various secretions, such as sebum. You have bacteria that are trying to get rid of the fungi, other fungi trying to get rid of the other fungi, and it's an all-in brawl, with nobody yet to win. And you're fortunate that nobody has won yet, because if they did, you would have a lot of problems. And mostly you'd have infection. Lots and lots of infection. Now there are a variety of, let's say, microorganisms on your skin, but the most common is going to either be yeast species, or they're going to be bacterial species. Both of them basically do the same job, but let's look primarily to start with at the bacterial species, such as staph. The staph makes a number of acids, and these acids help keep in check the fungi, because fungi is very sensitive to pH. Now, in other cases, you have yeast species, such as penicillin species, which can also produce it, but this research has pointed out a new example, the Malassezia sympodialis, which helps to essentially stop staph spreading. Now, this creates, as I said, a very delicate balancing act, where too much of one or the other would end up leading to getting an advantage and outcompeting the rest. And of course, that doesn't really happen, which is obvious from the fact that your face is neither rotting off, nor are you covered in an exceptional number of pimples, outside of puberty, which is an entirely separate issue, although arguably just as bad if not worse. In terms of wounds, we have how different species, and notably humans, have very different rates at which we heal. If you were to compare, just in the case of this study, rodents to primates, you would see that healing rates are much slower in humans than they are in other species. Now, this is by itself notable, but it does get to be more important when you look at what happens with that healing. For example, the human body, if you were to break a bone, you can recover from that, and even without exceptional medical care, you can recover the majority of your function without too much concern. If you were to do the same thing to a rodent, well, the rodent would probably die. And so, the much slower healing rate in humans appears to be responsible for that. In very broad terms, humans heal slower than monkeys, and monkeys heal slower than primates, in general terms. But then within the broader primate group, we have primates healing slower than rodents. So you have a sort of hierarchy. If we were to be a little more specific about it, baboons heal at about roughly 2/3 the rate of a rodent, and there doesn't seem to be much difference between the monkeys, baboons, and chimpanzees, and then from chimpanzees to humans, we have about a quarter of the rate. So humans heal only 1/4 as fast as a rodent does, which also explains why rodents breed like crazy. This is, however, notably limited by a few factors, one of which is very simple. It doesn't appear to rely on a lot of rodents. Understand, there were a few, and of different ages, but there were still not that many, so we're looking at groups of around 8. And 8 is not a good number for this. It is true that you'd struggle to be able to get approval for larger numbers, but you do need more than that to be able to reach these conclusions. In terms of the apes, numbers are a little bit different again. To be short about this, there were 5 adult chimpanzees with 1 female and 4 males. There were also several other species members, but in total, you're looking at a very small number. And then finally, we have the naked apes, better known as humans, in which there were 24 patients, 14 females and 10 males. However, it's important to point out that the average age between these was about 69, and the age varied between 25 and 99 years old. Of course, these same individuals also presented for a range of other reasons. For example, tumours, which would be a pretty big issue. So yeah, this research, although interesting, definitely needs a lot more data to be substantiated. In a somewhat more alarming bit of news, especially for those with celiacs, you should be afraid of kissing people in the mouth. Not because celiacs are involved in prostitution, but rather, it's simply because it supposedly causes an allergic reaction. Yeah. This research is, well, it's been picked up by The Guardian, so that should tell you a lot about its value, but in short, no, you don't actually need to worry. First of all, because you need to kiss for at least a minute, and given most sex lasts for barely a couple of minutes, and kissing is only a portion of that, assuming we don't count foreplay, you don't have much to worry about. But on top of that, the actual amount of protein that may somehow miraculously be transferred during that French kiss isn't enough to actually cause a problem. Yeah. Frankly put, you should be more concerned about the fact that you're going to be exposed to more of the protein responsible for that allergic reaction in celiac disease by virtue of proximity to the other person's plate or similar, their hands if they've been eating bread, for example, or something similar to that, not the kissing. Even if, and this is the other thing here, you were concerned about it, having a glass of water would wash away just about every possible ability, even minute traces, the faintest whiff of gluten, and leave you completely safe to kiss. In a case study that does present an actual legitimate concern, we have what has been titled Ischemic Colitis or Melanosis coli, a case report. In short, it's a case report talking about discoloration of the mucosa of your colon after taking certain medication. In this case, specifically the anthraquinone laxatives. Now, the symptoms itself aren't really too important. The symptoms are alarming, but it's really more a case study talking about what happens when you consume these in incredibly large quantities. And that is, your colon essentially becomes black or brown in pigmentation, and a lot of this leaches out into the feces, leading to, well, rather obvious problems. That is, rather than being the normal poop colour, it is an almost dead black colour. But further, when you actually look inside the bowel, for example, during endoscopy or similar, you would find that the entirety of the colon looks like it's necrotic, that is, it's died off. But no, it's just that it's occurred as a result of consuming these laxatives. So it's not actually dead tissue, it just looks that way. And it can be, without very close examination, and we mean close as in even more personal than shoving a camera up your rectum, not be easily identified. And without that, well, surgery seems to be on the cards, and removing perfectly healthy tissue, especially healthy tissue, the entire length of your colon, is not a good idea. Better news, or at least better news in that it's more useful, we have the sort of celebration of a man called Tim Fried. Tim Fried has been allowing himself to be bitten by snakes in order to produce antibodies to then be used for anti-venom. This is both a very dumb and very dangerous decision to make, but one that's also very philanthropic, so you can take it as a dumb and brave decision if you will. What happens is very simple. This man gets bitten by a snake. The snake injects venom into him, and his body goes, foreign substance, attack it, produces antibodies. They then take his blood, extract only the plasma from it, and ideally put the red blood cells back in, and then use that to produce anti-venom. The variety of snakes he's been bitten by will vary, but you have black mambas, taipans, cobras, kraits, and more. And in order to do this, he's had to be bitten more than 200 times, which is a certain amount of goodwill and charity that a lot of people would be challenged to pull themselves to actually do, no matter how charitable they think they are. Shifting to news that's slightly more, let's say, ancient, but also more animal-related, we have old evidence as to why it is the giant prehistoric Australian kangaroos were always going to die no matter what happened. And it's not just that it's Australia, which tries to kill everything under the sun, and anything under the sun that's not visible. In fact, it tries to kill everything, whether that's the environment, the animals, the ocean, the water, the fire, even occasionally the people, depending on which part of Australia we're talking about. So the question is, why is it that these giant kangaroos were doomed from the get-go? The answer is more or less all down to Australia's environment. That is, by looking at their teeth, or at least the archaeological remains of their teeth, the movement of these giant kangaroos was in a very limited area. They didn't have large habitats they travelled in. They're kind of like a panda in that respect. They would stay in somewhere that was lush and stable, more or less a rainforest, similar in some ways to, say, a sloth. Because of this, and the fact that Australia is basically one giant easy-bake oven full of deserts, fire, and similar, well, there weren't a lot of lush and stable rainforests for very long. This meant that their nice, happy habitat went away. And of course, without a habitat in which they can live, well, the giant kangaroos don't survive for very long. In the other extreme scale, we have tardigrades, and Chinese researchers who have been able to tattoo them. Now, the tattoo itself is not necessarily that much of an achievement. To some extent, we've been able to make tiny marks on all sorts of things for an incredibly long time. No, what's important here is more that the tardigrades survived this rather aggressive and very dangerous procedure. Yeah, that's the thing here. We've all known for a very long time that tardigrades are basically unkillable. They are like Batman and Superman's love child, except, well, microscopic. But they are just as seemingly unkillable. What the researchers did in this case was take a tiny sensor, tiny circuit, and a small robot-like structure, and it was able to shine light on the tardigrades. And in doing this, it was able to tattoo it, in a manner of speaking. The technology itself, apart from the fact that it's kind of awesome, as said, really does show the amazing resilience of a tardigrade, because if the human body had an equivalent amount of area of its tissue damaged by a laser, like the tardigrades were, we wouldn't really live, or we'd have a very low chance of survival. Our chances of survival are even lower again when you look at the fact you have to cover the individual involved with ice. Yeah. This is why we pointed out in particular. Not just did it happen, but there was a fairly high success rate, all things considered, at 40% survival, and it did show what they wanted to achieve. Whether or not this is useful in anything else other than weird novelties, well, we'll wait and see. In similar microscopic news, but one that we could actually see used in weird and wonderful ways, is a new kind of bacteria, admittedly one of many kinds now, that can conduct electricity just like a wire would. The mudflats of Oregon are a weird place, and it's where they found a variety of exciting and interesting things. In this case, it's a particular kind of bacteria called Laxatives yaquanensis, and, well, we're not going to bother into the naming sense because, frankly, it gets into a very murky area. But the whole general category, or let's say collective of these, are known as cable bacteria, which is why they're more broadly called cable bacteria, Laxatives yaquanensis. It is one of about 5 or 6 or so species, and they're split largely into 2 groups, Laxatives and Electronema. Both of them live in the same sort of environments, and both of them do roughly the same thing. They create the bacterial equivalent of a human centipede. Well, in this case it'd be a microscopic centipede, but the point stands. They set themselves up, head to butt, and create a long thin chain of these bacteria. And because they have this long thin connected chain, they can transmit electricity from one end to the other, just like the human centipede can, just with a very different material, or, in the case of the human centipede, actual material versus energy. What makes it possible for the bacteria to do this is that the outside of their body, or cell in this case, is made up of a weird morphology. What it has is a nickel-based molecule, and nickel is one of those things you would find in, say, nickel-based batteries. It allows for the more effective conduction of electricity along the fibers made up of those particular molecules. From an evolutionary point of view, this whole crazy idea makes a lot of sense, as what happens is the bacteria perform a reduction-oxidation reaction over a fairly long distance, very similar to how, say, a battery works, although slightly different chemistry. And by doing that, they're able to create energy by metabolizing sulfides in the case of bacteria, and in the case of batteries, well, there's a difference in charge. This in turn leads to not only the production of electrons, but also the transport of oxygen-rich material, which allows the cells to work and also provide nitrates to act as receivers for the electrons. All of this provides, to some extent, for survivability where there is neither light nor an excessive amount of oxygen available to work with. In and of itself, this is not a great deal of use, but it could be applied in, say, massive generation projects where you need to move a lot of electricity, and you could use these bacteria as a literal living power cable. In other instances, it could be used to clean up, say, spills in the environment of various chemicals, but a lot of that requires genetic modification, a lot of tinkering. It's something that India is doing, where they've now approved genome-edited rice. The rice here is very similar to, say, golden rice, except unlike golden rice, Greenpeace hasn't screwed it over. Instead, it's been approved in India, and it will allow up to 30% higher yields. Understand, this is not exactly, let's put it bluntly, this is not an ideal approval process, mostly because this particular example has been exempted from the normal genetic engineering approval process, and it's because it's been achieved largely using things that could have otherwise been done relatively straightforward with hybridization, crossbreeding, etc. It would just have taken far longer to achieve. And the reason we say you could have done this is that the actual rice, let's say, traits that are being used were already in existence in other indigenous rice strains, but they weren't necessarily present in the commercially grown rice. So again, in theory, you could have done this via crossbreeding, hybridization, etc., but it would have been that much more difficult, and it's why they were exempted from those rules. But if it had been any other kind of scenario, for example, a gene not found in an indigenous rice strain, then yeah, it would have been that much harder to get approval. And of course, this isn't going to be on the market tomorrow or even this year. It's going to take up to 5 years for these particular cultivars of rice to be available for sale, which means it'll take at least 5 years for the rice production to increase by about 30% if everybody started growing it, but likely significantly less. Even if it is somewhat less, this will still contribute extensively to food safety, food security, and food stability in India. Shifting now to something that will help you in your cooking, we have what is considered a trick by science that could delay your pot from boiling over. Although, as mentioned at the start of this video, it's important to remember this is delaying it and not stopping it, so you do still need to watch your pot, just in case. But bear in mind, a pot will also boil slower as long as you watch it. The idea is simple enough. What you want to do is take your pot and put your spoon over the top of it. That's it. That is all it takes. By putting your, remember, importantly, wooden spoon, so don't use plastic, over the top of the pot, you essentially provide a point at which the boiling water will stop itself from overflowing, simply because once it gets to the point of the spoon, that heat rising, it has a sort of barrier, a temporary interruption to the bubbles. And by doing that, you lower the surface temperature just a little bit. And by doing that, you slow down the rate at which it will bubble over and therefore spill over your stove, or whatever else it is you're cooking on. As the conversation notes, there are other things you could do rather than just putting a wooden spoon across your pot, but this is a relatively easy, straightforward, and very effective choice. Next we have what is contributing to the environment, and specifically those who are contributing most to the change in the environment. Now, the nature of the article is a bit interesting, as it argues that the world's wealthiest 10% of individuals are responsible for 2/3 of global warming since 1990. Now, this is a very weird way to phrase it for a range of reasons, not least of which is that they're choosing the top 10% of individuals. They've settled on approximately 2/3 of global warming, and they've set it on a date roughly 35 years ago. So this is all very, very specific and somehow seems more niche in some respects. The other consideration here is that, well, they haven't actually adjusted very well for the differences in who has produced the most amount of fossil fuels, and notably the decline in certain fossil fuel production. In short, we can say without much concern here that China makes up most of it, and has basically since roughly the early 2000s. Basically, the Western world, so Europe, America, similar, all went down in their CO2 productions, while China skyrocketed. Admittedly, other countries have increased somewhat as well, India being an example, but by nowhere near as much. And yet, for whatever reason, these researchers seem very much intent on blaming America, despite the fact that America is very much trying to decrease its production. The one catch to this, and this is a somewhat important catch, is that, for the most part, China's impact hasn't changed in terms of their top 1% contributors, essentially the ultra-elite. However, America has increased, which is a notable exception to the general trend of everybody else going down. But still, it's very strange. It would be like going to your doctor and saying, "Doctor, you fixed my broken leg, but my toe is sore now." Well, yeah, that was not the major issue. Your broken leg is probably a bigger worry. This, of course, does come back to the regular and somewhat, let's say, financially illiterate argument of let's tax billionaires and ultra-wealthy individuals who have a high net worth, but not necessarily a lot of fluid cash, which, rather obviously, does produce its own problems. And going now to news that might put you to sleep, We have maths and what is described as a, let's say, solution to the GON problem. That is, the polynomial equations that exist. There are 3 of them, and these 3 equations more or less have been a problem in mathematicians' side for 200 years, although you could argue even longer again. The solution, or at least, let's say, a proof of the solution, isn't necessarily so easy to understand, and mostly because this is mathematics, and if it wasn't dense and obtuse, it would have no purpose. It needs to be as hard to understand as humanly possible, and even then they're probably going to ChatGPT and ask it to make it harder again to understand. We're not going to go into a great deal of depth, mostly because we don't want you to basically have death by maths, but what they have done is use a combination of Catalan numbers and the more usual method of solving these things using various expressions, and they found, yeah, we can actually do this much quicker, basically by abbreviating all the normal numbers into something that simplifies it, in terms of very, very rudimentary understanding and description. This, of course, has opened the new door all the way into things called geodes, which means that maths has basically made things worse by creating yet more questions. Thank you, mathematics. Thank you. Next we have a somewhat self-defeating and honestly somewhat mind-boggling article from Nature Biotechnology, and what it essentially says is, the way we present research to the world once it is published shows you a fairly linear line, that is, from the start of your research to the end published research. What it doesn't show is all the failed branches where you've tried to use one method or another to prove what it is that you're trying to find. This is exactly what you are meant to do. The normal process, in theory, is you have point A and point B. Point A is you get your idea, and point B is you publish it. There's typically a midpoint somewhere in between where you should be testing it, but, well, depending on where you're publishing your research, that may or may not be necessary. But in most peer-reviewed research, it is. In reality, things go along the lines of, you start at point A, you find your initial hypothesis, you test it with whatever has happened, and if it works, you go down to the next step. If it doesn't, you go to the left or the right, and you basically follow a series of branches, with each successful branch leading you to the next step along the way. It's this final step, or the final method, in which we don't see all those extra failed or dead-end branches that they're complaining about, which is one of the dumbest ideas ever. Now, we could see some validity, in fact arguably very good validity, in showing what failed research was implemented. That is, what experiments did you conduct in order to get to the actual working method that you found. That would be brilliant because it would allow for the publication of negative result research in conjunction with positive result research. But that's still kind of a pretty big ask, to be honest. So, yeah. In somewhat dumber news, let's call it, lawmakers seeking to ban chemtrails. Yes, that conspiracy theory that says that when you see contrails from aircraft overhead, that they are actually something like crop dusting you and trying to change the environment by seeding clouds, mind control, or whatever else it is that happens to have taken their fancy that particular post on Facebook, X, or whatever else it is. So, yeah, this is already dumb enough by itself, but the laws could have actual ramifications, particularly for, well, aircraft in general, but in other ways as well. And that is, if they bring in these laws in, say, Tennessee or Alabama and other states where we're not really surprised to see it, it could have an effect on, say, the ability of aircraft to fly over that particular state or do certain things, because now suddenly they have to defend themselves from every lawsuit from every nutter who thinks that what they're seeing isn't a contrail, but a chemtrail. Yeah, that's the concern here. It creates huge liability for almost no gain, especially since every liability they're found guilty of, particularly with this law, could carry a $100,000 fine attached to it. So let's say you have 10 claims, and 9 of them get accepted, well, that's $900,000 they have to pay in penalties. And that's on a very, very conservative end of estimates. So, yeah, this law is not good law. Not the arguably worst example of bad law, but definitely not good law. In a similar legal-related news, although this time somewhat more political, well, political in terms of it being more about Trump than anything, but the Supreme Court of the USA, or SCOTUS, has upheld President Trump's ban on transgender military members for now. Now, this is not necessarily the end of it. Understand, the justices have basically said, okay, the lower court that blocked the ban was not right to do so. And, well, yeah, that's basically it. It allows for the, let's say, decision by Trump to stay in effect, but what it also allows for is the case, as it is proceeding at lower levels, to just that, proceed. It's not as though it's the end of it. It just means that for now, that ban is in effect. This will unfortunately have a rather large impact on those individuals who are enlisted and have gender dysphoria, as they will basically be medically discharged, which is unfortunate. We will point out, however, that this will affect only 0.2% of all serving US military members at present. It's important that we make clear that, strictly speaking, this is an example of where it needs to be examined in the context of what the actual decision is and how it's been implemented, whether you like it or not. The big issue here is that the Pentagon, as it has implemented this in a policy format, has basically said, we're looking at the medical condition, that is gender dysphoria, and how this will affect various things. And the result of that is they've decided that the effect is so adverse that we can't afford to have this liability, in their view, in the armed service. As such, they're not technically, as far as the law is concerned, discriminating. But you could certainly argue that that is the case, and it's more or less what the plaintiffs are trying to do. Whether or not, again, this works in the long term, that will be a bigger question. The final piece of news we have for you is still arguably political, but it's an example of human stupidity. It's a claim by a Bush official that the US is building a secret $21 trillion underground facility for the rich and powerful to live in if a near-extinction event occurs. They appear to be somehow mistaking Hollywood films for reality when they did so. Mostly because, first of all, Fallout wasn't real, it was a video game. 2, if this were true, and understand, if is a huge question there, it's not likely to be easily kept a secret. Mostly because the number of people involved, the sheer amount of resources, the movement of money, and everything else would basically make it obvious that something was happening. So, yeah, this is not really going to make much sense. Even more so again when you consider that they're supposed to have built 170 of these facilities across the country since 1998. You build 170 of anything across the United States of America, especially since this is roughly 30 years now of building, and somebody's going to know about it and tell about it well before now. It won't take a 74-year-old former bureaucrat talking about it for us to know. The justification they have for making this claim is that there's a 2017 report from Michigan State University which basically says that there is a butt-ton of unaccounted for money in terms of Department of Defense, Housing and Urban Development across that same time frame. Which, to be clear about it, unaccounted for spending is basically we lost the bomb, or there's a rifle missing, a tire blew up and nobody bothered to report it, that sort of thing. Not necessarily, well, in this case, we built evil lairs for the super rich and powerful. The perhaps biggest nail in the coffin for this is twofold. One, the claim that all of these facilities are interconnected by an elaborate transportation system is basically impossible, as America can barely keep its rail infrastructure working and its road infrastructure, let alone super advanced transportation systems between highly advanced military complexes intended for, well, basically living in the case of the end of the world. 2, that they're meant to be powered by a secret energy system. there are no secret energy systems. Just about all currently available energy is produced the same damn way. Either you have fission in the case of nuclear reactors, or you have some sort of combustion in the case of fossil fuels. Now, there is an increasing amount of use in renewables, which is either wind, hydro, solar, or similar, but they are somewhat distinct and separate again, and certainly by no means secret. As such, the claim that they're building these, or have built them more accurately, is just plain crazy. It's basically a 70-year-old woman has developed some sort of a neurological condition, whether it's dementia, Alzheimer's, or something worse again, and is now claiming that the government is doing something evil. Yeah, this is nuts, and not the good kind of nuts that are tasty, or the joking kind. That's all the news we have for you this week. Thank you for watching. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing, and please do post any comments, questions, or suggestions you have below.